Hi, everyone. Welcome to Hidden Wisdom by the Latter-day Disciples podcast. I'm Megan, and I'm so excited to have Emily Baker with us today. Emily Carolyn Baker is a mother, speaker, professional organizer, wife, and feminine spiritual leadership coach. She specializes in empowering women with a background in and around the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to embrace their feminine leadership potential as matriarchs, fostering deep healing and belonging. With a foundation in biology and psychology from Rensselaer Polytechnic University Institute,
You're good.
Emily has also studied systems and structures through MIT's Presencing Institute and their Theory U program, life coaching and trauma work through private high-level training programs and other non-traditional modalities such as energetics. Her education and experience has equipped her with a blend of unique tools to create truly transformational change. We're grateful to have you here today, Emily. Again, beforehand, we were talking about how we had the opportunity to just be acquainted socially, social media-ly, in the last little while, and I really appreciate some of the messages that you're sharing. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, you bet. No problem. I appreciate you reaching out and having me here. So sounds great.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit more about you and your background and how it is that God led you to the ministry that you're serving in now.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have kind of the classic born and raised Utah Mormon girl. My husband and I met in seminary, even and when we got married, it was definitely like the start of a new direction for me. I had dreams of going on study abroad and doing a lot of different academic type work. And I feel like God led me in this place of creating the Emily degree. And I feel like I was really studying people. I was studying behaviors. I was studying spirituality and new ways to think about it and look at it. And kind of led me on this journey of rediscovering myself and my connection with God. And I've met some incredible people along the way and have loved being able to share all of those things that I've gained with anyone and everyone that I end up connecting with. So in a nutshell, that's a little bit.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love how eclectic your background is, that like you had some like what you would call more formal education, and then a lot of it was just like things that you pursued on your own, right? So like what
Yeah.
made you interested in the areas of study that you went to, or was it truly just like organically God led the whole time?
It was purely like God led in so many ways. Like all of a sudden, I would have somebody who would just show up and I would be like, oh, I should message them. Or they would be like, hey, do you want to do this thing? I'd be like, sure. Yeah. And before I knew it, I was like, oh, wait, this is a thing. Like, this is actually becoming something more. I feel like my son and my kids were actually really instrumental in a lot of it too. My second son, I ended up having an emergency C-section with him, and he was like my little warrior. And that was in a lot of ways part of my spiritual journey began with that experience and looking for new ways to help find healing and recovery after that. And so that kind of introduced me into the world of energetics in a way that I wasn't expecting. My best friend's mom, all growing up, she'd been in my ward and stuff. She reached out to me and was like, hey, have you ever heard about, the connection between the body and the spirit? And that was kind of a first touch point. And it felt so like prepared. Here was this person I know, I love, I trust. She has a great connection with my family, where I feel like I would have been I never would have, I guess, basically reached out or pursued any of these things on my own. I was very not on my radar. Not everything was divinely inspired in every step of the way. So, yeah.
That's so cool. I think it leans in really well to what we wanted to talk about today, which is the dynamic of masculine and feminine, but particularly through the lens of understanding religion and spirituality, or religiosity and spirituality, right? So I love how you talked about that you are a feminine leadership coach. So obviously this dynamic of masculine and feminine, you kind of understand on a more general level.
Mhm.
And then maybe we could talk about that and then like narrow into this
Yeah.
particular lens. So can you tell us a little bit more of your background of like coming to understand masculine and feminine energy and like how that played into your story and now what you're doing to help women embrace their femininity as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for me, I think I grew up with kind of traditional, when you think of like masculine and feminine, like, oh, men and women was kind of the thought process there. And what I discovered and was kind of divinely led in was discovering that there was religion and like religious spirituality, which I was very familiar with and comfortable with, and then what I like to call secular spirituality. And secular spirituality was kind of a new area for me. And it was kind of this process. I actually had a moment of like, can I explore this? Can I look into this? What does this mean to start searching in that area? What does that mean for my religion? And I remember God being like, just for a minute, just open up and just see what is here. It doesn't have to mean you have to let go of anything in your religious faith or connection. It doesn't have to change anything of that, but don't try to like make them fit together right now. Just, you're religious, you have this here, let that experience exist there. And let me show you something new over here. And I want to introduce you to a different way of thinking about things and connecting with things. And so that's kind of what I did. And I kind of was like, okay, I'm just going to explore this world for a little bit. And it was really neat because what I discovered there is this idea of masculine and feminine. And the way I talk about it and teach it is masculine and feminine is not necessarily connected to gender or sexuality or personality or anything like that. They're two collection of traits. And so these traits that are traditionally masculine, you could describe something as being structured, ordered, direct, individual, whereas something that's feminine is cyclical, fluid, emotional, spiritual, whereas masculine is tangible and logical and linear, right? And so they're kind of like the yin and yang of life, and you can apply them in a lot of different ways. And so I started learning more about this way of seeing the world and describing different things. And even like I often use the idea of like a cup is masculine and the like liquid inside it is feminine because it's fluid and flowing, whereas the cup is structured. And so there's these different roles and relationships between the two as well, right? The purpose of the cup is different than the purpose of the liquid inside, right? And yet they have this beautiful relationship with each other, this dynamic with each other. And so we can use that to create kind of a new framework for understanding relationship and relationship dynamics and how do they interact with one another. And you can apply that to anything, right? You can apply it to a marriage. You can apply it to, like I just did, objects or like looking at the world around us. And here in this case, we can apply it to looking at kind of that balance of what is spirituality, what is religion, what are the roles of each of them, and what's that relationship dynamic between them.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. I think that this is really helpful, particularly when we're looking at these dynamics, as you said, on an individual level, right? So understanding that we all have masculine and feminine energy. In my research and studies, like I do see that there is a reflection between our bodies and our spirits, right? And so like I personally believe that our bodies are reflecting the prominent nature of our spirit, meaning as a female body, we have prominently feminine spirit, right? And that there is lessons that we can learn and blessings that come as we learn to align our body and our spirit in that way. Now, obviously, there's a lot of nuance to that. And I know for me personally, like my life and my mission, I require a lot of masculine energy. So I have
Yeah.
what I say is pretty balanced presence myself, just between the masculine energy of doing and structuring and organizing and containing, kind of like that cup analogy that you used, and then the feminine energy of just creative flow and like learning how to birth into existence, right? From creating spiritually and then bringing it into physical reality. So, anyway, hopefully that's helpful just for some context of what we're going to be talking about today. But I really appreciated that example. So, can we talk a little bit more about where we see masculine and feminine in this context of religion and spirituality? Like, why is it that religion is more of a masculine energy and spirituality is more of a feminine.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, masculine is very structured, and ordered is some of the traits for masculine energy. And so especially in like organized religion, right, there's that order again coming up, and there's this structure, there's a formal institution there. And so religion also we tend to think of like there are commandments, and there are, in the Latter-day Saint faith we have, right, ordinances, right? There are these specific structures, I guess, in place that are meant to help us develop and cultivate spiritually, right? So that's one way that we can look at religion and see that there's some of those masculine traits coming into play. And again, I think sometimes it can be really easy to look at, people like to say, well, our faith is masculine in nature or patriarchal, right? And say that that is what makes it masculine. And for the sake of this conversation, I would say that's not what we're looking at, right? We're not looking at who has the power. Is it men or is it women? Again, we're looking at these different dynamics and descriptions, right? So we're looking at religion from this space of, it is having some sort of structure in place that makes it easier to support the feminine, right? So part of the role of the masculine, again, is that structure that supports. And so similarly, we have like Come Follow Me is a lesson plan. It's structured, and it's there to support our spiritual learning and growth.
I really appreciate that you brought this up, because I do think there's a tendency for us to hear, oh, masculine, that's right, all our leaders are men. Like, we think of it that way. But no, just like the nature of it itself is what's masculine, in that it is the structured, orderly, instituted like framework, right, that you can build around. And so I make a similar comparison in my book, Consider Yourself as Eve, to in looking at scripture, right? So scripture, we could look at it and say, well, scripture is really masculine because almost all the stories are about men. It's all written by men. It was all edited by men. It was all translated by men, right? Like we could look at it that way, but that's not what we're talking about. What I suggest is that scripture is masculine because it is this tangible thing that's black and white, and it's delineated, and it's very it's easy to have an awareness of it. It's easy to engage with it because it's physical, right? And so like it's tangible to us. Whereas I would relate the light of Christ to be the equal opposite feminine, that like this is an equally important resource for us to turn to and to receive the word of God internally to our hearts. But because it's not written in black and white and you can hold it in your hands, it's much more ethereal, it's much more mystical and mysterious. Like it is more of a feminine. So I appreciate that you're drawing the same comparison with religion. It's not just that it's men that are in the structure. In some ways, like it's going to be masculine no matter what, no matter who's in the structure, because it is a structure. Hopefully that just helps make sense to people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that. And it's fun too, because the other piece that I think is going to come up for some people too is like, well, what if, I view scripture also can have this like feminine trait to it, in that, there's different ways of looking at it and reading it and applying it that are not so black and white, right, in that sense. And so it's like, well, isn't scripture feminine then in that way? And that's where, whenever we're looking at masculine and feminine, another key important thing to keep in mind is you have to kind of define the framework that you're comparing, right? Because you can always go back and forth and find, well, this is actually a feminine way of looking at that same thing, and this is a masculine way of looking at that. So I just want to add that extra thought in there. If somebody's like, well, wouldn't that make this feminine?
Yeah, it's really good to say. Well, and I noticed too that like the things that truly have like the hallmark of God to me are that way, in that they are very balanced, masculine and feminine. Like I think our ordinances are that way. I think that the temple is that way, our bodies are that way. Like everything that I think is closest to God really has this beautiful integration where it's hard to see where does the masculine end and the feminine begin, or vice versa. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah. And so, when we're looking at something like religious structure, or even just our physical environment. We're very used to looking at things of starting with the tangible, the physical, the masculine, and using that to help us find the feminine, the spiritual, the ethereal, right? And so, I'm going to read my scriptures, and then I'm going to have a spiritual experience from reading my scriptures. I'm going to go to church and that structured environment, and I'm going to have a spiritual experience from that. So we're very used to kind of starting in that masculine and then moving to the feminine. And that's kind of similar to even just like when we're born, right? I have a 6-month-old daughter right now, and she's very much like learning about her world and her environment through touching it, through tasting it. She's very interested in looking at things, right? And so we kind of start learning about ourselves and our environment from this like masculine space first into a feminine one. But that doesn't mean that's kind of only half of the cycle, right? We can also start in this feminine space, and that can lead us into a masculine one. And I think you were talking about this really beautifully earlier when you were describing the idea of like receiving this insight or direction and then creating something or birthing it into the world. You're making it physical, more tangible. And so there are some places where we start in the feminine and then we move that into the masculine. And that can be a much more difficult thing to identify or articulate or recognize, because it's much easier to take something tangible and then have that for context and have that for like a starting point, and then try and describe and take people on a journey to the intangible part of things. But when you're starting with something intangible, it can be harder to like get everybody on the same page first and then bring that into a physical expression. And sometimes we don't even recognize those spiritual or energetic beginnings until there's enough formed there to recognize it. Sort of like if you think of physical birth, right, of a new child being born, that early conception, right, we don't necessarily see it, we don't feel it, it's not something you sense the same way you can hold your baby once they're born, right? And so we often miss a lot of things when they're being taken on this feminine path and this feminine journey, and it can look like nothing's happening, nothing's happening, nothing's happening, nothing's happening, nothing's happening, nothing's happening. Oh, maybe something's kind of happening, it's not really happening, I wish more was happening, why can't we have more happening, oh my gosh. And then boom, it's like delivery happens and you have a whole baby right there, right? And so I love that perspective too, of recognizing there's this whole other feminine path as well.
Yeah. I even appreciate your hand motions. For those on YouTube, like that's actually really helpful to see this like transition, and it's a circle, right? At the end of the day, like the masculine leads into the feminine leads back to the masculine. And this is something too that I talk about in my book. In creation, we see this pattern of Adam was created and then Eve was created. And then in the transition into this mortality, Eve was the initiator, and she brought Adam with her. And it's one example of the fulfillment of the first shall be last and the last shall be first. That is the pattern of creation. And I think you're illustrating it really well, that is the pattern with masculine and feminine too. There's this dance that's taking place that the person leading out shifts throughout. But it's continually leading back to the partnership, right? And to this unity of the masculine and feminine. Another example that comes to mind that maybe can just make this idea a little bit more tangible of what it might look like to move from feminine undefined space into a more masculine, right? And I think that this is really timely for just where we are in the history of our world right now, and the things that we're looking forward to, is we have this desire, many of us, to help create Zion. And I think that we're looking at the masculine structures that we have to come forward and say, this is how we create Zion. But the problem with that is that Zion is a woman. And so the nature of Zion is feminine from the beginning. And so right now, what I see taking place, and I see this in our communities, I see this with friends, I see this in myself, and I see it on a global level as well, is that there is this grassroots creation that's taking place. It's deep in the soil, as you talked about, like it's not visible to the naked eye, but there's movement and there's life down there, and it's going to eventually emerge. And what it emerges as will be this new existence. It'll be this um, new dimension, new level of living in a terrestrial plane eventually. Like that's the hope, right? And so that's really exciting, but it is hard to define, like creating Zion in yourself first by, I think, this process of coming into unity in ourselves, of understanding our own masculine and feminine, finding balance in that, finding connection to God. Like that is going to have a physical manifestation, but we're not seeing it just yet. But it's happening. It's still happening. So hopefully that's something that might be relatable for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, maybe a slight tangent on things, but that I kind of want to explore when you bring up Zion here, because there's a really cool parallel with masculine and feminine energies and talking about Zion. I love exploring. And this is, anytime I'm saying something like this, I also have to put a disclaimer out there of like, I'm not speaking for the church. I'm not saying this is officially how it works. Like, this is Emily thoughts and logic and how I like to apply energetics to different things that we do know, and be, how can that help us understand things in a clearer way? And so I love looking at this idea of the gathering of Israel and the building of Zion as, again, this balance of masculine and feminine. And even those phrases that we use are so interesting, because gathering is feminine, right? It is, I'm collecting, it's bringing in, it's very community based. But Israel has this like masculine piece to it. There's that masculine and feminine there. And then when we look at building Zion, building is actually very masculine in nature, right? We're going to build something here, but Zion itself is very feminine. And so when we kind of look at this process of moving from masculine to feminine, when we're gathering Israel, it is like this masculine role to go on a journey to the feminine, right? There's a lot of purpose in the church and bringing people together to have these spiritual experiences. So we are physically starting with the masculine, we're doing missionary work, we're building physical, tangible temples, and we're bringing people to this spiritual experience that's going on. But Zion, on the other hand, is inverse and opposite. So we are starting with a spiritual nature. We're bringing hearts together. We're bringing minds together. We're building that unity within ourselves and with others. And we're learning how to operate in this co-creative way with one another and with God. And eventually that transitions and turns into what you were describing of this society and way of living here on this terrestrial earth. And so that will transition into a masculine experience that occurs. And so I just love kind of painting that parallel, because I think sometimes we can have those be at odds with each other. And it's very easy to get into this conversation of like, gather Israel, gather Israel, gather Israel. We hear all the time. And then there's kind of this chant on the other side of like, but what about Zion? What about Zion? We're not including everybody in that conversation. And it can feel like this tug of war, and can kind of put people in this place of like, I need to defend the church and what is being said about gathering Israel, or I need to defend the people of the world and that we're all God's children and that we're connecting. And that can feel like this tension that is at odds. And that's where I love energetics, is it's not that they're at odds with each other. It's that they are each a distinct part of this process and this purpose and this role. One starts with our humanness and brings us into a spiritual connection. The other starts with our spiritual identity and that kind of soul blueprint, like you were saying, and then brings us into a connection in our humanity. And so they have these inverse and opposite, yet equally important dynamics. And so learning to see that structure, I find so valuable, because it helps us see that wholeness. It helps us see that divine partnership. And so anytime I'm talking with somebody, I'm wanting to help them see and understand, what is this feminine process and this pathway, and how does that help us better understand this pattern of divine partnership?
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Thank you so much for that. And I love this pattern of creation and masculine and feminine, because it's literally everywhere. Like once you begin to see it and recognize how central it is to God and their identity as our heavenly parents, right? Like they are not one or the other. We tend to get compartmentalized, right? And we kind of look at it as, yeah, I would say those like mismatched polarity magnets, right? Where like if you don't have the correct poles aligned to each other, they repel each other. And I think that that's what we've seen in society, is this division between that which is focused on the feminine, the spirituality, our unity as all being children of God, and that's kind of seen as being in opposition to the masculine, the religion, the elite, society of like, we got to be in this group, right? And the truth is that these things fit together. But if their polarity is mixed up, they're going to repel each other. And so we have to learn how to shift the polarity, right? To create that unity between them. And that happens on an individual level. Like as we are learning to integrate our own religiosity and our spirituality and and bring those things into unity in ourselves, in our families, in our communities, like it's going to spread outward so that we can bring into a more holistic approach. So let's talk about that a little bit too. Oh, one more thing I wanted to say about Zion. So I have a friend who was talking about Zion, um, another level of this masculine feminine. This is just kind of fun. Like this isn't a big talking point, but like one of the things that we were talking about is how Jerusalem is like a masculine, right? And you can think of it as like the center of religion, like every religion, right? Every major religion is like centered in Jerusalem, right? And it's the law is going to go forth from Jerusalem. And then you have New Jerusalem, which is a bride, and it's a feminine, and it is the holy city, right? And so both of those things are to be established, meaning they're, on an esoteric level or on a symbolic level, like this masculine and feminine balance has to happen. Like this is a part of our own individual ascension, and the ascension of the whole world is dependent on this. So let's talk about some of the challenges maybe that we are experiencing now in our church, outside of our church, globally, that is maybe making it difficult to correct polarity and bring religion and spirituality together.
Yeah.
So I'll let you lead off. Like, what do you see?
Cool. I love it. It's such a great question. And it kind of ties into some of the things I wanted to comment of what you were saying before, because I feel like that example you used of getting the polarities right is one of my favorite things that I do. And in fact, in like the life coaching work that I do, I help people understand like their relationship dynamics, whether that's like your relationship with food or your spouse or your kids, in terms of that like energetic polarity. And when that polarity is off, there's this extra effort we have to like compensate to try and like fit those two opposing ends of a magnet and try and force them together. And it takes so much more work and effort, and there's a struggle, and it's hard. But when you get the orientation right, you don't even have to like do anything. It just like naturally comes together. And I think if I, at least for myself, in a lot of those experiences that have felt most divine or synchronicity have been like that, where it's just like something just falls into place and just kind of is pulling it into happening, whether it's meeting the right person at the right time or hearing the right words that speak to your heart, or just, those moments, they come to us. We're not having to force them or make them happen. And so I love also helping people understand when we get that dynamic off, it's not that we need to like try harder or force this or get people to understand or make it happen. Oftentimes, I call this the imbalance of masculine and feminine energy, where when our masculine energy gets imbalanced, there's a desire to control things, right? So we're taking that order and we're forcing that order or imposing it in some way. And similarly with feminine, there's actually a feminine imbalanced expression that we're not used to thinking about or viewing very often. But that's actually a desire to prove or justify or even like educate and explain. Like, I need to get you to understand. That is a similar feminine type of control. Actually, we're used to,
or maybe manipulate would be
yep,
the strong word to use there. Yeah.
and part of that also, and it can be even just in a way of like, I need to make myself feel comfortable with you understanding where I'm coming from. And I'm trying to get you to make sense of this important thing and recognize it. So I'm trying to prove to you why this is right, or I'm trying to justify how I'm feeling, or I'm trying to over explain to you why this matters. And there's a very difference in balanced or aligned feminine energy. Does not have to prove, does not have to justify. It's very experiential based, right? So I'm not explaining to you. Masculine is like a lecture, right? You go to class, you learn the things, here's the rules, this is how we do it. That's masculine instruction. Feminine instruction is relational. So you learn to see who somebody is by their fruits, right? You don't need to be saying it. You don't need to be talking about it. You just be it. And so the feminine is very much this being expression, or the masculine is a doing one. So I think on an individual level, we sometimes get stuck in trying to balance those things. Like, what do I need to be doing? And how does that help me better be who I want to be? You know, so I might feel like I don't have enough worth if I'm not doing certain things. And we're very used to operating in this masculine pathway that is, I do something so that I can have something, so that I can be something. And so it's like, I'm going to do something like go to college so that I can have an education and get a degree so that I can be successful. And even in a lot of the church frameworks that we're taught in this like masculine space, follow this, you need to do things, you need to pay tithing, you need to go to church, you need to read your scriptures so that you can have, this is the piece I don't feel like we talk about enough. You're supposed to be having spiritual experiences so that you can be happy and connected and have a greater relationship with yourself, with God, and with others, right? But typically tend to view it as like, you need to do this thing, like pay your tithing so that you can have a temple recommend so that you can be righteous. That's how we often interpret it. And that's a tweaked, misaligned view of the masculine pathway. It's actually trying to bring us into this relationship. But there's also this feminine pathway, and that starts with the being. Who am I going to be? And that will naturally lead me to do certain things. And as a result, I will have those things. So when we look at sort of that feminine process of creation, even if you want to go and look at it in kind of a more secular, spiritual woo state of like, what's your vibration? And what are you being? That brings into naturally what actions are going to follow. And, you know, the secular spiritual languages, that's what you're manifesting as a result. But I think in our even doctrinal description, there's very much this essence. And even looking at Jesus Christ, he knew who he was being. He was the Son of God, right? And he focused on who he was being. And that's what naturally led him to do everything that he did, from connecting with this individual person to being in the Garden of Gethsemane to being on the cross, right? Each one of those things was motivated and driven by who he was being. And as a result, he was able to complete his Father's work, right? That was right? We got to receive that blessing of the work that he did. And so we can follow that similar pattern as well as, who is it that we are desiring to be, or who are we understanding that spiritual nature of ourselves? And that is naturally going to guide us into the inspiration that we're going to take. And sometimes, again, we use that like we're talking about the feminine pathway, but we're trying to apply it to the masculine one. And so it's like, well, you are a child of God. And if you're a child of God, then you'll naturally want to read your scriptures and go to the temple and do these things. And that like can cause tension there, right? Because you're like mixing these two ideas. And so that's why some people get really frustrated, because they're like, but no, you should have this like natural desire and it pulls you there. And other people are like, but this is a checklist and it doesn't feel right and I'm not connecting with it, right? We're not understanding there are these two different pathways here, and they are both about relationship that is spiritual in nature and tangible in nature. There are both components in it, but the way we approach it is differently. And so when people are saying things like, I only need God, I don't need the church, they're tapping into that feminine pathway. They're saying there's a relationship here. I recognize my spiritual identity. I know who I am. I know that connection. It's important to me. And that naturally leads me to the things that I'm going to do in my life. How am I going to teach my children? What are the things I'm going to do? What, even on a day-to-day moment of like, what promptings do you have? What guidance do you have? That personal revelation bit comes from that spiritual relationship first. And they sit there and they go, and I'm having positive experiences as a result of that. And so they go, this is good, right? And there's a lot of struggle then of, why is this good? And do I need that masculine element? Right? And oftentimes we get into a conversation of like, nope, this is good enough, or no, it's good enough as long as you're reading your scriptures and you're, having these spiritual experiences, that's enough. And it's no, we need both of those pieces there. And so even if you're not in a like formal religion following a specific set of practices or different sacred texts that you're studying, as human beings, I love looking at like we have a need for spiritual health the same way we have mental health and emotional health. And so fundamentally we all need both parts of those pieces. And as individuals, we can look at the world through that space of like, do you have spiritual practices that you are doing and that you're following that are that masculine one? And oftentimes we love to find communities of people who share those same practices with us and that help us in that relationship to the spiritual connection. And then we also need to be having that individual one. And there's just so many ways you can look at that pattern of like prophets and leaders having this like masculine thing of like general authority and perspective, but then personal revelation and individual, general leadership of the structure of an institution, but also membership input and saying this is what we need. Like there's this beautiful relationship. You take any problem, any question in the church, in the world at large, and you can break it down to what is that masculine journey, what is that feminine journey, and kind of see, are we mixing those things, and where can we like understand that path better to find that balance and to find, oh, we need both pieces here.
This is so good. I'm getting so many insights from the way that you're breaking that down. I really appreciate this idea of the masculine path and the feminine path, and that you need both, and that they need to be appropriately ordered to each other, right? And so and have the right polarity to each other to make that work. I think that that's really beautiful, and I have a lot of thoughts that we could go into on that, but I don't want to. I want to keep going on this path. So,
Yeah.
so I think that it's easy. I hope that it's apparent that we are all pretty familiar with the masculine path, right? Like we're all of us, men and women, doesn't matter. In Western culture, we are very familiar with the I've got to do the thing in order to have whatever. A lot of the time, it's self-esteem, a sense of my own worth, a degree of control so that I don't have to be afraid. Like it's not always a healthy thing that we're trying to have, right? But we have to do the thing to have whatever, healthy or not, so that we then have a sense of who we are, right? And our identity, right? So that feels very familiar to us. And I think that there's a lot of traditions and things in the church that kind of support that side of the journey. And again, that's not to say that this part is not important. I want to come back to that as well. I appreciated how you showed. And this is why I love to look at everything through this lens of masculine and feminine, because it's, first off, it's the lowest common denominator. Like everything, every opposite in the world, you can deduce down to masculine and feminine. But it's one that we just innately know, like you need both, right? Like we need men and women for creation, for existence, right? And so once you narrow things down and put those, like, I don't want to call them labels, but when you can categorize them and help see like what the energy is of certain things, you can then see how they need to be unified and how to appropriate, and that they are necessary for each other. If we just kept it at this general level of religion versus spirituality, then it's easier to be like, oh, you just need religion or you just need spirituality. And that's when you kind of have this pendulum shift, right? And this is something that I see too, where it's like maybe you've had the religion and it wasn't necessarily your choice. Maybe it was just your tradition that you grew up in, and then you see flaws in it and you're like, this is not doing it for me anymore, so I'm going to swing all the way over here to spirituality and say, oh, I don't need any of that. I don't need any organization. I don't need, and God is in the balance, right? Like God is always both. The answer is always both with God. So let's talk about that a little bit, and about how like our approach to religion is, it tends to be more masculine, and like what are some of the things that we need to be learning and becoming more comfortable with to help us integrate the feminine, because the feminine is the piece that's missing for both men and women. Really quick, one more thought. Like in my new partnership now with One by One, we're working with couples, and our goal is to help men develop their divine masculine, overcome addiction, their problems, whatever, and like actually step into their role as men, which is to provide and protect for the feminine. That's really the role of men. Okay. It has been rewritten into provide and protect for ourselves, which masculinity does have this individual focus. So you can see how it can shift into that. But ideally, in a complete, correctly polarized operating system, the job of the masculine is to provide and protect for the feminine. And so that she can do her work, which is to enliven everything, to bring everything to life, make it all beautiful, make it flow, make it work, make it worth living, right? So what I was just going to say though is that in working with both men and women, what I see is that both men and women are cut off from the feminine specifically. Men have been disconnected from their own emotions, from their ability to communicate, from their need to have healthy relationships, particularly with their wife. Like all of that has been suppressed and degraded. And that's where we have this like toxic masculinity comes out of this, right? Of like men who don't know how to relate to themselves or anybody else because they're cut off from their feminine. And then the same thing for women. Women are cut off from our feminine, which means that really we're cut off from our own identities. It's a big problem for women especially, right? And it creates a toxic femininity as well, which is very imbalanced. It's very masculine. It's kind of a counterfeit where we have women that are trying to take control, trying to step into the shoes of men, and they can do that. Like it's not a question of capacity, but it's not going to be healthy in the long run, and it's not going to support the growth and the ascension and the creation of humanity when women do that. And we end up being very burned out, very unhealthy, very angry. Like it's not good for anybody, right? But like I just say that to say that like we can't get away from learning how to integrate the feminine as men or as women. Like we both have been disconnected from her and from that side of ourselves, and we need to reintegrate it. So let's talk about that in the case of our tradition. How is it that masculinity has been prioritized? What do we need to get comfortable with to reintegrate the feminine side?
Yeah. So I love that you brought this up. And before we go further in the conversation, I want to add one other perspective here that I think is going to be really helpful for people. And I teach like a whole other like course and class on this. So I'm going to give you like the condensed short version, but it's a really important thing for me when I'm talking about masculine and feminine energy and even polarity to bring in this idea that there are different layers of our masculine and feminine energy. So I actually map out some of the different layers of that expression of masculine and feminine energy, because sometimes people get confused when it's like, everybody has masculine and feminine energy. What does that mean? Right. And so I talk about there's these different layers. So like the most surface level layer is what are you currently active in? So like when I'm resting or I'm sleeping, I'm in a feminine state. But when I'm actively like doing and I'm on the go, I'm working, whatever, I'm in masculine energy, right? So that's like the most surface level expression. The very core expression, everybody has masculine and feminine energy. And the way I like to think of that is like two halves of a whole. So I'm holding my hands up together for those of you who are just listening and not watching, but it's like my hands are in a fist and they're up against each other. So one half hand is masculine, one hand is feminine, but they come together and they create like a core polarity is what I call it. So when you were talking about, you have the belief or idea of like our spirits are mainly one, and then our physical bodies have that expression of that. So if you have a more feminine spirit, you would be a woman. And if you have a more masculine spirit, you would be a man. The way I would describe that in energetics is everybody has that masculine and feminine energy, but you have a core polarity, which is basically a charge that defines when you are in relationship with another partner. What does that look like? And so typically when we look at like a man and a woman who are in relationship with each other, if you have a man, they typically have a core polarity that is masculine, and women have a core polarity that is feminine. And that's necessary for the role of creation and what they can do together. So on an individual level, because we each have masculine and feminine energy, there's a lot that we can create with that ourselves as one person. But when we come into partnership, we're working on another level. And so it's like amplifying showing what you can create and what you can do, but you have to have that core polarity in balance. And so I have another, like I said, little video that goes into this in more detail. Maybe we can link it in the show notes if somebody wants to dive into it. But basically, there's this idea too that it's often what you were describing in these imbalances that we see show up in people, and especially in relationship dynamics, is it's like there's an overabundance of that masculine energy coming out, and it kind of gets in the way. So for men, we tend to see it's like amplifying that core polarity that they have that's masculine, and like there's too much of it there, and so we need that feminine to kind of come back in and help rebalance it. Whereas for women, what they experience is this like masculine energy coming out, and it's like it's masking or blocking their feminine energy, which describes what you're saying of like really being cut off from that core sense of who you are. And so there's another reason why people are often talking, and we see this a lot right now in church culture, of like women are the ones who are hurting, who are struggling a lot more than we see it in men. And it's like, well, why are women being so vocal? Why is a lot of this coming up? And there's multiple discussions and arguments and things we could say for that why, but for the sake of this conversation right now, we can say because there's that cutting off that is happening. So it's a lot more visceral in a way. And as women, we start to understand what that feminine energy is and bring down that masculine shield, as I sometimes like to call it. There's a protectiveness there, and that protectiveness kind of comes up, we could say, because of the imbalance of the masculine there, right? It can trigger that sense. And so the masculine is sitting here like, I'm trying to do what you want. I'm trying to help. I'm trying to show up. Why are you still upset and bothered? And it's like, well, there's that masculine shield in the way. And the feminine is like, I want you to be balanced first so that then I can feel safe to be in my feminine, which there is some of that dynamic. And as women relax into their feminine, it helps naturally through that feminine pathway of relationship, the men or learn, oh, this is what my feminine is. This is what this is. And we see that happen a lot with women who kind of start going on these journeys and exploring things, and then their husbands tend to come along with it because that's feminine journey of relationship. And the struggle is a lot of women want to take that masculine pathway and say, you need to go to therapy, you need to understand these ideas, I need to share all this thing with you, like, can I just explain it all to you? Like, it would be so much easier if we did that. And we're not understanding the role of the feminine is relationship. And to me, there's so much at the heart of the gospel and at the heart of being a disciple of Jesus Christ and the things that he taught that was feminine led, that is starting with that spiritual nature, that worth, and bringing it into the physical. And so even when we look at the verses of like charity and it's long suffering and it's kind and it's patient, like it's describing that relationship path. And like I sit here even as a parent, and it is so much easier. I want to be with my kids and just be like, just do XYZ. Like it's not hard to do this thing, right? And I would arrive at that result, and I can swing into having too much of my masculine energy come out, and I want to control them, and I want to force them, and I want to just clean up your room, right? Yep. Like we just get done. But then there's that feminine pathway too, right? Of being in relationship, and that I have a lot more often success and easier experience with each other when I am willing to sit with them, right? That they're learning things from interacting with me. So am I there with them, showing them how to clean their room as they're going through it? Or am I just like, I'm caught up in my thing and all that I'm doing, and I'm like, please take care of yourself, right? I am too much masculine, so I'm trying to project that masculine on them as well. So understanding that polarity dynamic to me helps also break down why, we have these sort of stereotypes or gender roles, and sometimes people are like, no, those are really important, and then other people are like, no, they don't matter, like anyone is capable of doing anything and they should be doing both, and we shouldn't have this just be like men and women thing. And so to me, the energetics helps us understand why there's this truth of like, oh, it is most natural for a woman who has feminine polarity to be the caretaker, because that is her energy dynamic. And so it makes sense for that. And it makes sense for a husband who is got that masculine core polarity to be the provider and the one who is out working, because it works with his energy and it works with her energy. That's not to say you can't find other ways, right? In
Right.
similar calling, I do a lot of work and my husband does a lot of caretaking, but we've had to learn, how do I do that is in a way that still balances our energy. So he is still very much the provider, in that his job and his role is like making sure I have the food that I need, making sure I get the sleep that I need, making sure that I am cared for, so that when I'm doing my work, it's less about me being in my masculine energy and more about me being in relationship with other people. And I'm allowing that feminine caretaking to come into my work and my expression, so that we both still get that like rejuvenating experience out of it, but we're not, that is matching our energy, but we're in a different role there. And it's cool because I can check in with myself, and I know I've been way too much in my masculine energy if I'm annoyed with my kids. Right? That's like one of my biggest indicators that I'm out of my feminine energy. When I am in the richness of my feminine energy, I love being around them. Like I love spending time with them. And it's a good indicator for him that if I'm getting annoyed with the kids, he knows it's his role, that something is off and what he needs to be providing for me. And sometimes that is, she needs time to herself. She needs space for herself. And so he steps up into his masculine to support me in that way, so that I can get balanced in my feminine. Because the same way that role of the masculine is to provide and to protect, it's that structure, it's that cup there that gives the life and the flow. So I benefit, my children benefit, he benefits when I'm in that feminine space and understanding that role.
I love that. I love all of that. I really appreciate this because you're sharing a lot of things that I am that are familiar, but you're sharing it in such a way that it's different. And I love it. I love it. It's like new layers of understanding. And so I really appreciate that. And I love what kind of the illustration there of you and your husband and like finding this polarity and balance and um really opening up the possibility of like how the masculine protects and provides can look very different, and it really depends on the feminine. Like it really depends on you and what do you want. I think that's a big question that women need to ask themselves is what do you want and what are you called to, and then maybe you can explore some possibilities with your husband about what does it look like for you to actually protect and provide in the context of what I really need, right? Because sometimes I think we can get too stereotypical and say, well, the husband providing and protecting just means he has to be the moneymaker. And I think that a lot of the times that works really well. Like I think that women in their flow, women with their feminine, with their missions, a lot of the time it is more centralized to like them and their kids. And so that works really well for I think a lot of couples that are balanced in that way. But like for women like you and I, where it's like, yeah, I've got young kids, but also I've been called of God to like do some bigger stuff. Like how it looks for our husbands to provide and protect for us in this context. Maybe it's not that they're out making a ton of money all the time, but that they are. I mean, I loved what you said about like they take care of the meals, they take care of the housework, like they're there to support you with the kids so that you can go and do those other things. And then it's this beautiful flow, give and take. I think that that's awesome. This is what I've realized too is that the masculine, it does have this energy of more individualistic, right? And the feminine is more of the relationship and community gathering that you talked about. Like that is more the feminine. And I think that maybe part of the way that we've gotten imbalanced is that the masculine has oriented around itself instead of orienting towards the feminine, right? And so what I mean by that is you have an individualistic nature that has oriented to, I just need to take care of myself. And when you have as men or women in that energy, like that is selfishness, that is addiction, that is apathy, that is not progression, that's not a growth mindset, right? Like it's very egocentric. Whereas the correct orientation would be a masculine that's oriented towards the feminine, right? Towards I have a responsibility to this external, universal, creative force, right? And I see that in my own needs. Like I see that in my own emotions, that like those are things that I need to be taking care of. I see that in my relationship with my spouse, where like I need to be meeting the needs of my wife. I need to be orienting to providing and protecting for her and not just providing and protecting for myself. And then more globally too. Like I think that religion in general and like the church, like it is meant to provide a container and a structure that allows for the flow of that creative potential and that energy that the feminine brings, that just that enlivens, right? And I think that it's unfortunate that it's unfortunate and very understandable, I think, that the energy has shifted that way, because this world, as I like to say, it is run by an imbalanced masculine. Like, of course, it's centered around the bachelor idea of life, right? Because that's what Satan is. So do you want to talk about that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Oh, yes, I do. And I love that you brought this question up because this is one of my favorites. And it sometimes bugs people, but I love the idea of like, I'm always going to go to bat for the masculine. And
Yes.
not because it's not important to recognize the ways in which we've had this overabundance of masculine. Absolutely, we need to. And we need to be able to say, this is not helpful, this is harmful, this is not what I want, right? That experience, that anger, those emotions, that hurt, that pain, it is very important. We know it must need to be there's opposition in all things, because that's what gives us the clarity of what it is we do want. And that's what helps us focus and find God and that divine relationship with a lot more clarity. So anytime we have those contrasting experiences, we want to recognize them, but we don't want to get stuck on saying, I don't want this, I don't like this is a problem, this is bad, this is bad. We get the information, we get the data, and then we need to shift and orient towards, okay, now what is it that this is helping me understand that I want? Right. And I love what you said, that the role of the masculine or the role of the feminine is to actually be able to say, this is what I want, right? What the feminine is kind of defining, what do I want to create? And then from that, the masculine comes into support. And I think this is one of the dynamics we're trying to figure out in church culture and structure right now, is that role and that relationship. And I think from a sort of a tangent, but I'm going to circle back to your question and where you went with this, is that I think we've actually had the role of the masculine has been a lot more feminine in nature in our church, which is kind of a unique thing to see.
This is always the imbalance, right? Is the
Right.
masculine becomes the feminine and the feminine becomes the masculine, but it's not healthy because
Right.
it's that reversed polarity. Yeah.
And so we're trying to figure out that, and we're trying to recognize that, and we're trying to find the language and the words to describe that. And so we have that experience going on where right now the masculine has been kind of too much in the feminine and the feminine has been too much in the masculine. And as we go through that reorientation to get into the right place, there's growing pains and there's discomfort, and it feels like we're stretching and like, whoa, things are really off now. And it's like, well, yeah, because we're moving into that correct orientation, but we're going to get there. So I put that out there as like a vision of what we're going through, why it matters, what we're working towards, and how we're going to be getting there. Right. So on a church level, I think that's a piece of it. And we see this happening more and more, that women are starting to get into this place of like, I want this, I want this, I want this, I want this. And it's not coming from a masculine lens. The masculine views that as wrong, because that is getting too much individualized and too much focused on the self. And if masculine energy does that, it causes the imbalance. And so there's an innate thing in the masculine to say, don't do that. Don't be selfish. Don't focus on yourself. Don't do these things. And the feminine is over here starving and so depleted because she actually needs more of that masculine to balance out. Right. It's why
she needs more of that intrinsic. Well, and it's that identity, right? Like we have to start with where we are, and who we are is abundant and powerful and ascended, and like we're having this mortal experience, but who we are as women is so powerful. And so we have to go back to that space, because that's our journey, right? Is our identity comes first. Whereas the masculine, you're right, the masculine is a putting off of self, doing the job, experiencing the results, and then you come to a knowledge of, oh, I have a divine
Right.
identity too.
And
It's the
so
opposite.
exactly. And so because we have this like masculine pathway that we talked about in religion that shows up, we have a lot of really good structure for taking men through that process and like helping them learn that. And they put up self and they become very serving and very like oriented in that way. But what we have right now is the feminine has been going through that same developmental pathway, and it reverses her polarity. And it is reaching a point where women are like, this is so backwards to what I need. This does not feel comfortable. It is actually making things worse. And the masculine has no concept of that, no connotation, because it has worked perfectly, right? And so it's like, well, you just need to do this. And it's hard because there is that underlying like masculine spiritual structure that we talked about earlier of, you have your scriptures and that helps you have spiritual experiences, which fosters your relationship. And so the masculine is like, yes, when I did those things, it helped my individual journey of my masculine energy grow. And the feminine is sitting here and saying, okay, I did that too. And I have some masculine energy. And so it helped that part of me. But my feminine core polarity is starved. It is very not fed. It is not nourished in this way. And there's not a really good system or structure in place to help cultivate that feminine spiritual development. And that's what women, I feel like, are craving and calling out for so much right now.
Right. And part of that is because it's the very nature of femininity, right? Is that it's not this structured thing. And so it really is this internal individual journey that each woman has to take for herself. And that can be really scary, to kind of let go of our tight hold on the masculine. Like, it is very vulnerable. There's a reason we put that mask on, right? That masculine mask, because it's so insecure to be. And I don't mean insecure like, oh, I'm insecure as a woman. I mean insecure as like, there's not the surety, like there's not this sense of like groundedness that the masculine has, right? But like, we have to go on that journey. And so we have kind of this such a fascinating scenario, right, where we need men and we need the masculine to let women step into this space without them going with them, right? Like, I think that's what you're getting at. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And right now we have women who are kind of courageously doing that on their own. They're going on these individual journeys, right? Just talking with you, I can tell you have been on a journey like this, right? You've gone through that individual process. God has called you, right, to this place, and you've had to have those individual experiences. So women are going through this. But the problem is right now we have a viewpoint on that journey and that process as saying that's bad, as that's pulling you away from the church, as you're stepping away from how the right thing is to do things. We're not recognizing women are supposed to, right? And I sit here and I daydream and I fantasize about different things. And so sometimes I think about like, what would a young women's program look like that is about, you're going to go on this individual journey. It is going to be hard. You are going to feel like you are in the depths of darkness. You're going to feel alone. You're going to feel like you don't know who you are, right? Just because it's individual, just because it's intangible, just because it's not like structured in the way a masculine journey is, where it's, if you look at the priesthood for men and the way they like go through different callings and hierarchical, there's a reason hierarchy shows up in the masculine energy. That is part of their development. You move from this thing to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. Hierarchy is not inherently bad, right? There is a role and a purpose for it. I am a parent. There's a hierarchy between me and my child, right? There's a difference, and there's a reason for that, right? Sometimes we get
hierarchy is not patriarchy, I think, is what we're trying to say, right? Like, patriarchy is that imbalanced masculine, and that is what, like, it's a corruption of the hierarchy. But the ideal hierarchy is, I think, and like I've expressed this a few times, I think that like the true pattern of priesthood, like what priesthood is supposed to be teaching you, is like a mentorship program.
Yes.
Where it's like, I've been there, I know where you are, let me help you get to this next level. And also, I have a mentor who's helping coach me to get to my next level. Like, that, I think, is what priesthood is supposed to be representing.
Right. Exactly. And I love that you put that framework in there. And even just like taking again the analogy of like parents and children and what that dynamic looks like, and then looking at like our heavenly parents and us, right? It is again a mentoring relationship there. So then if we pull this over into the conversation of looking at what is that feminine mentorship, right? And that's what's happening. And I'm curious to see if you've had this experience. But for me, in my own individual journey, yes, it was individual. And yes, it's like giving birth. Like, to me, there's a reason women, we give birth, because that is such the perfect process that maps out what the feminine journey is like, right? It is this individual thing. You are going to have this creation of this new life inside of you, of, whether it's a business or your calling with God or your, physical child that you're creating. There's a gestation period, and there's the discomfort and the nausea and the growing pains, and like as you're stretching beyond your normal limits, and you feel by the end of it like pushed to your breaking point of like, I am so uncomfortable, I just want this feeling to go away. And it doesn't go away, it gets worse in a way, right? Because now you go into labor, and there are these contractions, and there's this whole process you have to go through of labor and delivery before something happens. And that is very similar to this process of like birthing the new version of you. And the same way we can have, birth classes and women who teach about this process. And it, even around birth, we still have a lot of this negative connotation, and it's scary and it's dangerous and it's hard and it's painful. We have this like negative connotation around the feminine journey, that it is bad and it's negative and it's going to pull you away and it's going to lose your testimony and like whatever, all these things. But like, imagine a young women's program for a minute that was like preparing you in this way and saying, you have this priesthood role and this priesthood job to mentor and be in relationship with other people, to help them discover their spiritual identity and relationship with themselves, how to be in relationship with other people from that spiritual place. And the way they will learn that is through their personal relationship with God and the divine, and learning how to follow Christ as that perfect example of that. And as that being your role and purpose, here's this individual journey you're going to go through, and it's going to be hard, and I'm going to walk with you, and we're going to hold you, and we're going to support you as you go through that journey. And if that was a regular integral part of our faith, right, that just naturally brings the divine partnership into parallel. It makes such perfect sense then of like, how do these pieces all fit in together when we bring that journey and that spiritual development back into it, rather than like, at least the version of personal progress I grew up with felt like a version of the Boy Scouts. And it was kind of like, we have no idea what the feminine journey is or what women need. We just know they need something. And
Checklist.
This is the model.
That's how I did it. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it was
personal progress. It was like, oh, I already did that. Like, I didn't even go do new stuff. I was just like, oh yeah, I've already done that. Like, check it off. Yep. I think I finished it when I was 15.
The epitome of the checklist.
I got nothing out of it.
Exactly. Because that's not how the feminine connects, right? The masculine loves that sense of achievement and accomplishment, and there's something I'm working towards, and it has this greater purpose. And like, that's why it was so valuable there. And it like, I don't discredit. I do believe it was inspired. I think there was a purpose. It was a stepping stone here to recognize we need something here for the women. And now we're in the next step of creation and saying, yes, we need something here, and this is not it. Right.
And I think, to be fair, I think the youth program has incorporated more of a feminine energy and like letting them set their own goals and like develop, and like recognizing there is a structure of like, here are different areas of development that need to be addressed, but like how you go about doing that is kind of up to you. But I think the trick then is to not fall back into that like just action oriented, everything I do is just going to be stuff I do. Like, some of it has to be self-discovery and like developing that relationship with God that's very ethereal and things like that. But
which is where I actually love this idea that with Release Society, you complete youth, and it's the women are put into Release Society, and the men still have like these additional callings that they can have and work into, and it's just sort of like an open playing field. And I remember feeling a little bit sad and lost of like, there's no definition. There's no like, I get to aspire to this, or I get to aspire to this. And I actually view that very much now from the perspective of like, that's perfect, because there's just space here for the feminine to say, where do you feel called? Where do you feel you are meant to show up? You have the space. and we're
Yeah.
here to support you in that, right? And
Yeah.
that's, I think, the piece that we're working on shifting and trying to figure out, what does that relationship look like? What does that dynamic, instead of here's the priesthood leaders and I'm calling you to this thing and I'm telling you what you need to do. And I think we're expecting and we're used to that masculine direction coming in. And I think it's really beautiful as we start seeing that dynamic of like the feminine is here saying, I'm in the community, I'm with the kids, I'm here, I know like what we need. My job is to be plugged in into that relational space, and then come to the masculine and say, here's what we need. Here's how we're going through this. And the masculine's like, okay, how can we make this happen? Here's what we've got. What can we do?
Mm.
That dynamic, that's where we have that like divine partnership synergy.
It'd be so powerful if we said to the women, what calling do you need? What calling do you belong in right now? Like, let women decide that for them. Oh my gosh. Like, wow. How much would that change things? Like,
Well,
overnight.
I was just talking to, I had two cool conversations the last 2 weeks. Last week was with MacArthur Krishna, and I was talking
Mm-hmm.
about her Changemakers book. And
Mm-hmm.
the other was Amy from Women on the Stand on Instagram. And Amy shared some beautiful examples of like when she has experienced relationships like this. And she's like, it happens. Like you can
Yeah.
still do it. It is occurring. So I don't want anyone to ever have this illusion of like, well, that's not going on. I think that's one of the ways we can look at why do some people struggle in the church and others do not, is where's that polarity dynamic showing up? Are we getting in that right orientation, or are we not?
Yeah.
And when we are, we can have these beautiful synergistic moments. And the general conversation that I feel like we're having right now is, how can we shift so that the default mindset that we're all kind of culturally operating in is like, the bones are here, it's set up for
Right.
us to be able to do it, we just got to understand it, we got to operate in it and make that more of the main thing. And MacArthur
Yeah.
was so great, is she was talking about how a lot of women are already doing that, right? Once they go
Mm-hmm.
on this individual journey, they're coming up. She shared this beautiful story of a friend she knows who was like, our youth are failing in school just terribly. And so she created a tutoring program for their youth in their ward. And she basically
Mm-hmm.
called herself to the calling and saying like, Bishop, we need this and I'm willing to do it. And he was like,
Yeah.
great, sounds like a wonderful thing. So I think we're seeing some of that, and there have been moments of that. And that's what her book was talking about, was trying to highlight, hey,
Mm-hmm.
we've had these moments so that we can start having these conversations and getting used to that relationship. And even viewing that like in a relationship with a spousal one, right? Like I love
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
moments when my husband comes to me and is like, what do you need? I feel so
Yeah.
loved. And I love being able to come to him and be like, this is what I need. And I don't have to have the weight and the direction of like figuring out. He's like, okay, I'll figure out a way to make it happen. Like, then
Yeah.
I just get to I get to enjoy
Yeah.
those moments with him.
Oh, so beautiful. So powerful. Like I haven't explored this. Like I don't really, like on the podcast, we don't really talk a lot about like the church as an institution, really. It's just not something that I feel like we need to talk about. Like I like talking about doctrine better.
Yes.
Because, and I think because I do see this like personal authority that we have to have our own journey with God, and that like God wants that, right? And so but wow, like it is really powerful to see like how just if like subtle changes could just totally right side that polarity and cause that magnetism, right? Subtle changes, as much as like, okay, we know the priesthood structure now, like I don't know, like I know I have men who listen to the show. If you're in a leadership position, or if you're in a position where you have some influence, like maybe just ponder what it would look like to just turn to the women and say, you tell me where you need to be right now and what you need to be doing. And yes, there will be women that say, I am drowning right now, I can't do something, right? Like, talk to me later. Like, there will be women who say that, because that is a part of our journey, is that we go into the depths. We are dead when we are having young children, okay? Like, all of our life force is given away at that point in time. But there will also be women that stand up and say, I love that example of like, we need a tutoring program, we need a special needs class in primary, because we have all these special needs kids that aren't getting the attention that they need. We need, like, there will be women who will stand up and will say the most amazing things because they are called to it, they are directed to it, and they have the stewardship to say and to receive from heaven what is needed for our community to come to life, right? And we need men who understand that and give space, hold space for women to come in and birth all of the things that you are needing right now for your ward.
Yeah. And to me, as we become more and more of a global church, that to me is the key. Like, you can't have too much masculine structure. The bigger it grows, if you have too much masculine structure, then it starts containing and it doesn't fit or feel right. So if we really are serious about our doctrine and the things that we believe, and creating this like universal family and being a worldwide church, we have to learn this new pattern so that we can have enough of that structure there in place. But how can we actually use this beautiful tool that I feel like we've been given in the formal institution of the structure? And then when we use, that's when we build Zion, and it accelerates and things just like start going from there. And I feel like that's where we're like on this brink of like being able to really understand that and start utilizing that. And so when people talk about like, well, we need the formal system or structure to change, are there places that that could happen? Are there still things to be revealed? Probably. I don't think that that's fully, our tool is completely built the way it's meant to be yet. And there's so much that like is there and that we can start using. We don't have to wait. And it's going to be like energetically says, both of those things come together. The more we learn and understand and use the tool, the more the tool is built. And the more the tool is built, the more we can use and understand it. Like they both work together. And that kind of leads to like the last thing I'll say, really circling back. I talk about the institution because that's what I'm passionate about, is helping people understand, like, how do you balance these things? What does this look like? But bringing it back to your original question of like, how does this play out in society and this like overdevelopment of the masculine? I think one of the key pieces of this too is we have been living in this like fallen world. And so when it comes to these ideas of like, we have addiction or we have struggle or pornography or whatever it is that is there, that is because having left God and now being in this physical plane, we have forgotten that our security and our stability is meant to come from God, right? And so we're looking for it in all these other external things. And when we reconnect with that spiritual and we remember that well-being and we remember that wholeness and that safety and stability and security that comes from that spiritual part of us, then that's when like we can naturally navigate the physical things. And I think we've learned patterns and tools that are born from this physical, tangible experience. And we're learning how to reorient right now as like a collective human society more towards that spiritual orientation. And what does that look like? And how can we marry a lot of, I think you look at society, we started in tribes, we started very connected to the earth. There was this like feminine spiritual space, but we needed the masculine to come online. We needed to develop a sense of identity and a connection to this world. And we had the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the American Revolution.
Yeah, the protection and the providing, because it was definitely like survival was not not great back in the day, right? Yeah.
Right? Like we needed that to come online and have a bigger, better understanding of this physical world that we're operating in, right? And now that we have such a beautiful understanding of it, we're seeing that blending of the masculine and feminine again coming together. Even with like the social revolution or even technological advances, we're starting to see that blending coming back together. And so now that we have kind of learned more about this physical world, we've developed more of that structure there, we're like bringing that feminine back online again. And that's sort of this process of we've been missing it in ourselves, in our relationships, in our society, in our church, in like all these different areas. You take any system, any structure right now, whether it's education, politics, religion, we're all going through this process individually and collectively of like reintegrating that feminine. And the key is learning how to do that in partnership with the masculine, not just like a continual battle or replacement one of the other, that there is this synergy and we need both of them. And when we get that momentum right, it'll be like riding a bike and pedaling, and we can balance, and then we can really go places. And to me, that's what Zion in the millennium will be.
Yeah. And I think that that's true. I think I've seen this pattern just throughout history and throughout like even stars in the heavens, like the signs in the heavens is this pattern of, you have the bull, which is the mother that leads into the goat, which is the son. And then you have Pisces, which is this very, feminine that's supposed to lead into where we are now, which is Aquarius. And like, anyway, this doesn't really matter. But like, I'm just saying,
I
like, there
love it.
is this
Love it.
beautiful, like, synergy of masculine and feminine that's supposed to take place. And I think we got stuck. I think we got stuck in the masculine. And I think the masculine, it just, I like the way that you said it just gets oversized, right? And it cuts off its own feminine, and it also cuts off the feminine of everything else, right? And so, like, it really is just going through this process of rebalancing. And this is why, like, the prophecies about Zion and this idea of a marriage, of a wedding feast that we're preparing for Christ and the bride, like, those are archetypes. That is the masculine and the feminine coming together and like coming back into this energetic flow where they support each other and they are balanced with each other and they understand and respect the need for one another, and they are more interested in how do I how can I provide for you what is needed, right? In both ways, right? Because the women want, like, it's not just, I mean, it does start with like a self interest of like, I've got to know who I am and I've got to know my own power and I've got to step into that. It starts there, but it ends up being all about community. It ends up about being, it's about my husband, it's about my children, it's about my family, right? Like, that's what it ends up being. And so making room for that in ourselves, our own journey. And the women, like, women, guess what? Like, it's your turn. Like, we're leading out in this. So I'm so excited to be a part of this. I really appreciate the things you shared because I think that it added so many additional levels of understanding to me. Like, I'm not an expert. I've been studying this for a year and a half, maybe. Like, I've gotten a lot in that amount of time. Like, it's been very intense, but like, I don't know everything. And so I love what you shared, and it's definitely given me ideas. And like, I think that this is so crucial to understand who God is as our heavenly parents, to understand Christ and his role, and to understand ourselves. And at the end of the day, like, Zion is not going to be built unless we figure this out, like, unless we can integrate that feminine piece back. And so I appreciate you and your ministry and everyone else who cares and is listening and like is trying to work with God to understand how to do this journey, because there is not a manual, but it is absolutely essential to the work that needs to take place. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. The last thing I'll add here, I appreciate you having me here, is as you were talking, it made me think of like the pride cycle in the Book of Mormon. And like when the women become lost, that's when the only option becomes destruction, because it's like at that point, there's too much of that masculine and you can't bring it online. You just gotta kind of start over. Right. And so seeing this call of like when President Nelson is talking about like, women, you have a role right now. You need to understand your divine identity and your purpose and your role. Like, there's a reason for that. And I think that's why so many women are feeling that pull and feeling that call, and why it's so important that we're supporting each other in that and recognizing like how much that matters. And so I just appreciate so much that you're creating the space, you're having these conversations, you're sharing your wisdom and being that example, and that I got to hang out with you today and chat about my favorite
I
things.
know, so much fun, right? These are my favorite conversations too. So, no, I'm grateful. I talk about in my book that women, especially, like, we all have a piece. We all have a puzzle piece. We all have a comb for the beehive, and the beehive is getting assembled, and we all have a piece in that. So, coming together like this, building communities, building relationships, going through doing that individual internal work that is your own feminine journey, like, this is all a part of it. And it's like the most exciting thing ever. So I'm grateful that we could share our honeycombs today.
Me too. Thank you again. It was wonderful.